From deep under the sea, born of shipwrecks, stone bricks, and ocean creatures, is the Eerie guardian of the lighthouse. This is what we're making today, and nothing will go wrong at all. We'll start by twisting up an armature using wires from when I thought that I'd take up bonsai as a hobby. They died. I'm working on learning better proportions with assistance from some anatomy and sculpting books. I'll first build out the basic musculature and bone bits, then add some muscles. Here we're basically making a sketch of the armature so that we can visualize how they'll be creeping up to the lighthouse. Partway through this, I'll decide that I want his stomach to be more gaunt and concave, so I'll tear out his aluminum intestines and replace them with a hollow clay belly. To pose our creature, we'll whip up a quick and terrible 3D sketch of a lighthouse using some scrap cardboard that I had lying around. Then we can pose our creature around this to get their general shapes correct. Next, to finish the last bit of our armature, we'll make our guardian some hands. One will be a lobster claw, while the other will be a mass of tentacles, made of wound floral wire bent into a proper tentacly shape. I'll affix both of these to our creature's wrists, and then I'll actually decide that I want our lighthouse to be a lot smaller so that our guardian seems even more massive and looming. So I'll fix the lighthouse template and change the positioning of our creature so that they're in a more looming, yet protective stance. To prepare for being able to add more details and really create our creature, we'll keep building up the muscles, sticking with big flaps and noodles for now so that we can blend it all together and really shape it out later. I'll shape up the muscles with my twisty loop tool and then smooth it all out with my big loop tool. As you can see, I definitely strayed away from my promises of proper anatomy and leaned heavily into making it up as I go and doing whatever feels neat. Also, if you're curious about this very homemade looking sculpting tool, it's just an old takeout chopstick and a scrap piece of wire. And the other tool you see me using is just a smaller bit of wire stuck in a scrap pipe from who knows where. After I finish going through with my loop tools, I'll finish off this task with an alcohol dipped brush to enhance our smoothitude. Once the smoothing is completely finished, we can admire our progress for a few seconds and then immediately start in on the desmoothinating. Oh, and if you're wondering why you see a cat hair on any of my sculptures, this is why. We're starting off with making some gross pustules. Each pustule starts off as a platform of clay that gets encircled by tiny little orbs. Then it all gets blended together with my tiniest ball styluses. The idea behind this is that our lighthouse guardian was created by an amalgamation of sea, land, and the wreckage of ships that ran aground over the years before the lighthouse was built. So let's make some really big splinters and shove those into our platforms. To make our ship debris, we'll shape up a ship-shaped lump of clay and then add a little detail to the underside before baking it. After baking, to make our ship-shaped lump ship-shape, we'll use a Dremel tool to carve out the inside so that it looks a little bit more realistic. Then, when that didn't really work, I'll carve out the inside with an X-Acto knife instead. And, pro tip, don't slip. I sanded some toothpicks off camera and these can function as masts. Now our ships look a little, well, wrecked, but hey, they're shipwrecks, so I'm gonna say it works. Now we can start sticking the various bits of ship shrapnel in place, and then build up our infection around the splintery bits, making them look a little bit more like they're embedded in the skin, rather than just being added on top of all our lumps and bumps. Now it's just a case of making a whole slew of these embedded pieces. I have two different ideas of what caused this creature to exist. The first is that it was these sunken crashed ships that caused this creature to be born from the tortured sea, to protect the lighthouse. The second is that these wounds made the monster want to protect the lighthouse to save other ships from impact, to avoid further pain. A recurring issue that I encountered during this sculpture was the temptation to let the too much gene take over and make everything overcomplicated. I kept wanting to add an extra 5 or 10 more ships, and I think that would have made it a lot tougher to appreciate each one, and give the eyes too much to look at all at once. Lighthouses have been built in this spot before and have crumbled, which is why we need this guardian. To show this, we'll add part of a hollow tubular lighthouse embedded in his thigh, and a few stair steps smushed into choice locations on his body. This also emphasizes that he's the lighthouse guardian, not just a shipwreck guardian. Next, I'll emphasize some of the lumps and slabs on his body into shell pieces, like a crustacean's carapace. This mostly involves booping the clay with a flat silicone shaper, then using several ball styluses and loop tools to texture the spaces between the plates. I'll then use a larger ball stylus to add a few carefully positioned dents on parts of the shells to show that this is a well-battered and ancient creature. For the right foot, I'll haphazardly add a few spines because, sea urchin? Actually, this doesn't really fit with the rest of the sculpture, so I'll take all of these out and then just make two very uncomfortably human feet. This helps bring back the human aspect into our sculpture and is also a test on whether or not I can sculpt a halfway decent foot. Meh. I considered baking the body separately and performing a quick and mostly painless decapitation, but then opted against it because I wasn't confident in my ability to blend an unbaked head into a baked neck. So instead we'll play doctor with a cheerful lobotomy. Once this is smoothed inward, we'll make two little clamshell halves using a ball stylus and a heat gun. Then both halves can get jammed into his noggin, and then we'll add some clay to the inside to make it all cohesive before we add a little pearl in the center. Or I guess, giant pearl. Next we'll add some ocean vegetation growing out the side of his dome, followed by some more of our pustules around the back of his head. Next, we'll stick on two little globs of clay for his eyes. Just kidding. Our guardian is blind, like a ship without a lighthouse. His eyes are two nasty, yucky bits covered in a seaweed blindfold. I thought about making his mouth two little noodly bits, but then thought that the blank, silent, mouthless stare worked a lot better. If you have a better idea for what our silent guardian could have had, well, it's kind of too bad, because this is what I did. His hands still need to be very handy, so I'll slap some clay onto the lobster claw and get it into the shape I want. Then we can start adding some ridges and lumps and details until it looks kind of clawsome. Get it? After I finish the claw, I'll bake the sculpture for the first time, since I can't imagine doing the last bit of sculpting without a quick bake so that I don't smush all of this hard work. And then finally, we'll make his left-hand tentacles. I really boxed myself into a corner when I made the armature here, since it was so tough to get the clay evenly onto each digit. But you know what they say, when you box yourself into a corner, just keep digging. Or something. They say something. Once the tentacles are shaped up nice and noodly and the wrist is looking wristy, we can reposition them into the correct locations. Then we'll use a toothpick dipped in some liquid clay to add dots for each sucker. I just wanted to experiment here and see if it worked better than the last time I made tentacles, and I thought it went okay. Tentacles finished, we'll give our creature a final bake, and then we can get started on painting. With our sculpture primed nice and bright white, we'll go over it all with a slightly off-white. I struggled to figure out exactly how I wanted this to be painted, but I thought that a pale behemoth rising out from the deep blue sea felt decently eerie. Plus, it seems like creatures from deep dark places are often pale and blind, and since our cosmic horror guardian is from the deeps and has no eyes, it seemed fitting. Once our white monster is slightly off-white, we'll use a very thin blue wash to give some recessed shading into some of the places that would collect shadows. This also helps our creature seem like they have pale blue veins under the skin. To paint the pustules, we'll start with a green rotting skin wash over each, letting it sink into the nooks and crannies between the lumps and veins. Then, once we have the greens finished, we'll come back with a murky red inflamed wash to make them look even gnarlier, hoping that each embedded piece of ocean detritus looks as horrible as possible. I mean, if you had a splinter for 1,000 years, you'd have a pretty nasty infection too. At this point though, I realized that I forgot to dry brush the skin, so I'll do that now with a brighter white. Unfortunately, this dulled all of the work that I just did on the pustules, but I'll touch each up with another round of washes after the dry brushing is finished to bring that grotesque vibrancy back. Next up, we'll paint the claw with a couple layers of orange washes, followed by an umber wash sponge bath. I had some issues with the wash getting all bubbly though. If anyone knows how I can avoid bubbles in my wash, or if it's just inevitable, please let me know. Finally, we'll highlight the claw's edges with some Spanish tile dry brushing. I felt like the infected bits still weren't vibrant enough, so I did a little light dry brushing in a fleshy red color to make the raised bumps and veins pop. The spindly tentacles will get painted with a series of alternating purple and blue washes, and then dry brushed in a lighter blue-green. I really wanted to experiment in this sculpture with washes and dry brushing, and I felt like I definitely learned a lot, but I still have a lot of practice to do. Next for our behemoth, we'll paint the staircases in his legs with a stonewall gray, then give the same treatment to the crumbling lighthouse tower lodged in his thigh. All these pieces then get a black wash and a lighter dry brushing to bring out the edges and recesses. Moving on to the head, we'll first paint the seaweed strands on his head dark green. Then his blindfold seaweed gets the same green but finished with a black dry brushing. Finally for the head, we'll paint the outside of the clamshell gray, then give the inside a fleshy pink. And then last but not least, the pearl will get painted with white paint mixed with mica powder to make it gleam. And that didn't work at all how I wanted to, so I'll end up going over that with a white ceramic glaze. Now on to the mega splinter shipwrecks. We'll make the ships embedded in his calves metallic, painting the speedboat silver and sparkly blue, and then painting the dinghy plain silver. This hopefully shows that the scene takes place in the modern age. To emphasize, though, how ancient this creature is, we'll paint the rest of the ships in wooden colors, turning them into old galleons. I really love the contrast between the pale skin and pustules and the dark wood of the ships. Once each piece of wood has been painted, we're done here with the Guardian, and onto our base. The base starts off as a chunk of blue foam that I'll cut into shape. I'm hoping this looks like a rocky outcropping rising from the sea floor. Once we have the general shape of our base, we'll detail the cuts and texture the rocky part with a rock. Textured and shaped, we can now cover it up with some lovely Alfredo sauce. Well, it's a mixture of sand, Mod Podge, and gesso, all in a leftover sauce jar from last week's dinner. Whipped up, this will make a textured sandy coating to prime our foam and give it some texture. We'll spread this onto our base and then add a few choice rocks and pebbles on top for additional texture. Once that layer is dry, we can smack our base white, and then get started on our lighthouse. This is our makeshift template, but it's bad, so let's make it better. I'll take a small lump of clay to be our hillside and then shape it until it's hilly. And then I can gently boop it with a rock until it has a rocky texture that feels like it could be natural. Then it's ready for some buildings. To make our buildings, we'll roll out a sheet of clay and then impart some gentle flat rock texture to one side. Then we'll slice this into definitely measured squares and rectangles. Then, after a quick bake, we can break each piece apart and start shaping out our buildings. I'll build up each wall, then fill in the bad edges with some liquid clay. Then I'll make a couple little clay roofs to add on top. Now that I know where the doorway is, I can also make a little path of pre-baked stairs going down the hillside. Now that we know how big our houses are, we can plunge a tiny hole into our clay hill and move on to the main event, the lighthouse. I want this lighthouse to actually function, so the hole is for the wiring that I'll add in a moment. I'll use a little metal tube as reference to shape out a hollow bit of clay, and then poke and prod some rocky stone texture into every inch. I'll also make a few little window indentations that I can paint black later to give the illusion of a hollow interior that the lighthouse keeper could climb up to perform maintenance at the lighthouse top. We'll stick the lighthouse into our hillside, and then to prevent me from smushing all this progress, I'll give it a quick bake. Oh, and yeah, in the middle of the night, I got up and attached the hill to the base, but didn't film any of it. Oh, and I carved a super secret tunnel for my wiring and battery pack. Anyway, let's start building the top of our lighthouse. We'll start by soldering our LED to some wires and then running those through the top of our lighthouse into a battery pack. And after about an hour of work, nice. Then we can cover up all that ugly wiring that I didn't have the heart to make look halfway decent. But hey, as long as I cover it up with some glue and tape, no one will ever know the ugliness that lurks down below. To top our lighthouse, I'll start with 4 toothpick pillars and then top them with the carved end of a stir stick that I permanently borrowed from my job. There's a few unsightly gaps, so to make it more cohesive, I'll wind some string along the edges until the top is covered. Then I'll add the end of a chopstick to be our dome and top it with a toothpick nib. The end result looks a little rough, but some paint will help it recover and shine bright. With our lighthouse complete, we can paint our ocean floor a dark sandy color, then turn our rock into a deep, dark gray. Once that's dry, we'll hit our sand with an umber wash and the rock with a black wash to bring out the recesses. And while I have the black wash out, I'll also hit our lighthouse tower as well. Next, we'll break out the old dry brush and give our sandy bottom a couple progressively lighter dry brushings to emphasize the raised bits and give life to our texture. Then we'll do the exact same to our rocky spire and lighthouse, starting with a couple of light browns and grays, then moving up to an almost white to tickle the tips. The houses on the rock will get some Spanish tile roofs and whitewashed walls. And then I'll paint the doorway and windows on the tower. Since I have the color out, I'll paint the top of the lighthouse to match the houses, but I'll quickly change that over to a coppery color, since I thought it looked better. The posts will then get painted a dark silver, and the tip of the spire can get painted with the same color to stand out as well. Then everything gets a nice light gray wash to make the white less jarringly white, and then blend everything in with the landscape around. Finally, I'll add a few choice splotches of green wash here and there to give the barest essence of green life. Now it's time to put it all together. We'll fit our guardian into place and then set down our shipwrecks. 2 old ships and 1 modern fishing boat. Then, just for fun, we'll add a whale suspended on an acrylic rod. To set up for our resin pour, we'll use hot glue to attach an acrylic sheet frame around the sculpture. Then I'll use UV resin to secure the base. I've had bad experiences in the past with foam contributing to a crazy amount of bubbles in resin, and my hope is that the UV resin can lock the air inside the foam so that it can't escape into the main resin pour. Speaking of, I'll degas the resin in my vacuum chamber and then gently pour it in. This for me is the scary part. Before I went to bed, I could see that my resin was overheating, melting my glue mold and making the acrylic frame hot to the touch. There were also a few bubbles starting to form, which was really disheartening. There's not much left I can do for tonight though, so I'll put the project in a cheap baking sheet so that if the resin leaks more, it only ruins my $5 tray instead of my table and floor. Then I'll set a plastic box over the top so that my cat can't go anywhere near it and get hurt. All I can do now is go to sleep and hope for the best. It's the next day, and things aren't as dismal as I thought they were. I can take off the acrylic sheet frame with some pliers, which went super smoothly without any frustration at all, as you'll see, over these next few very calm moments. The acrylic rod for the whale wasn't as invisible as I thought, but it's enough that I can pretend that everything is fine. The main issue so far is the bubbles. It's not horrible, but it's definitely noticeable. Of course, just when you think that one thing is the main issue, another will show itself. When I was chipping away at the acrylic frame that was way too stuck on there, I shattered the leg of my sculpture. But I'll do my best to glue it back together and recover. I can't go back in time, so I just have to do the best I can to make things better. I'll finish chipping away at the frame, scattering thousands of clear little plastic splinters all over my apartment to stab me over the next few months. And then I can hide the majority of those horrible chisel marks with some UV resin and breathe a sigh of relief that I was able to pretty much recover the sides of the ocean. The cracks in the leg were painful to look at, but that's when my partner suggested that I could add some plant life to them to hide the cracks, and honestly, that was a stroke of genius. So I snipped a few bits of oceany looking plants and wove them around the cracks to hide them. She also suggested to add a few more to some other spots, since if you cover up one spot, it's an accident, but if you add it somewhere else on purpose, it's a choice. Overall, well, it's not perfect, and that's okay. With the frame off, I can now clean up the edges and apply some water texture to the surface. I'm using some heavy gel gloss to make my wave texture for the ocean. I used way too much gloss, so it didn't dry clear, which was actually not as bad as I thought it would be. I can pretend that the waves are frothy on purpose. I'll put up some varnish and some choice places on the creature's body as well to show that they just came out of the sea. And that's actually us finished, and we can take a look at our Lighthouse Guardian. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed seeing our spooky Lighthouse Guardian come to life, then die slightly, and then come back to life again. If you did and want to see more, consider subscribing, as I'll be posting a new and strange sculpture every other week. Until next time.